Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We're so excited to have you guys here today. We'll give people a few minutes to trickle in. I hope you guys are all having good Decembers. I know in some places it's getting warmer, very exciting. Oh, my mom is here. Hi, Mom. It's good to see you guys. Well, hi everyone. Welcome. Thank you guys for coming. I'm so excited to tell you guys about this research that we've been doing for like almost a year and a half now. So we'll go ahead and get started and talk about this great stuff that we have going on. So, hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lydia Burns, and I'm the manager of youth and community partnerships at Seek Common Ground. So at Seek Common Ground, we help communities, especially those who don't always have a voice, like students, families, and educators, find common ground and take collective action. As the manager of Youth and Community Partnerships, I manage the Student Action Network for Equity, or SANE for short, which is a massive network of over 90 student and intergenerationally led organizations across the country. Each of these independently led student organizations is advancing racial justice, ed equity, and multiracial democracy, as well as protecting students' access to public education. So back in 2024, we had some conversations about the importance of student voice, which we've defined here on screen. We talked about how it builds agency, it improves academic outcomes, and it makes communities and schools just safer and more just spaces. To the folks in the same network, we were all like, yeah, obviously, it's something our students see and practice every day. But we wanted to see what was out there to empirically support this idea by conducting a literature review. When we set out to do this, we knew we wanted to center student voices as much as possible through the process, even though this is going to be a more like academic project than we've taken on in the past. And we also knew we really wanted to center the voices of young people. I know many folks would say that I'm a young person, which is very nice of them to say, but it's actually been a minute since I was in high school, so we were lucky to involve a team of young people to work on this. I'm really excited for you to meet Spanina, who is our SANE fellow who worked on this project with us. She came to us as a sophomore at Vanderbilt. She already had an incredibly impressive research background with her work with the Kentucky Student Voice team, where she led their Coping with COVID report. It's been a pleasure to work with her, as well as 7 student researchers, 3 of whom you'll get to meet on this call. And so I'm really excited for them to tell you about all this great work that they've been up to. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Spanina and the team to talk about what they've been up to.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Lydia, and hello to everyone. Like Lydia mentioned, my name is Spandana Pavalori. I'm now a junior at Vanderbilt, and I've been working with Sea Common Ground as the SANE intern and head of this research project for over a year now, which feels so crazy to say. I began doing youth participatory action research several years ago when I joined the Kentucky Student Voice team. And like Lydia mentioned, I led their Coping with COVID research study, which garnered over 10,000 responses from Kentucky students. And then I continue to engage in research at the Youth and Society Lab that I am involved with at Vanderbilt. And I believe my lab professor is here today. With that being said, I'm really excited to tell you guys about the methodology of this project that we use to create this report on the benefits of student voice. So I'm going to go ahead and just dive right in. So back in January, we hired 7 student researchers ranging from ages 14 through 22 from the Student Action Network for Equity. We had a variety of responses and applicants to our survey for interest, and the students that we selected had wildly different degrees of prior research experience, which was honestly exactly what we were looking for. We really wanted the goal to be to make research feel approachable and accessible regardless of prior experience. So from January through May, we would hold bi-weekly meetings over Zoom. So we first began by training students in youth participatory action research, also known as YPAR methods. We would train in literature review methods, and then also in collective coding. And then at the start of every meeting, we made sure to do icebreakers and just other community building practices that SANE uses in order to create an environment where students could bring both their challenges and their successes. In one of our meetings, we also had the pleasure of having Assistant Professor Daniela DiGiacomo from the University of Kentucky share her experiences with youth participatory action research and really serve as an exemplar for the role of intergenerational collaboration in research work. So, after this, for several months before each meeting, students were instructed to collect 5 peer-reviewed studies related to student voice in a shared data logging spreadsheet. And ultimately, it resulted in over 80 logged studies to reference in the analysis phase of the project. So, students would use search terms such as student voice K-12 empirical or student voice youth impact. Or youth voice high school empirical YPAR to give you guys some examples. And students primarily use the Google Scholar platform to search for studies. The studies that students typically included were published all within the past 25 years, but we actually had the majority from the past 15 years, just so, the research we were referencing felt pretty relevant. Students logged various details about each study in our spreadsheet, such as the year that they were published, the location the study was based in, the sample of focus, primary findings of the study, amongst other details. So after we did all of this logging of these studies and had this database, then we delved into the analysis phase of our work. So in this phase, students engaged in 2 rounds of coding. So first we had a preliminary coding round, which really involved assigning codes such as positive, positive conditional, neutral, negative, and negative conditional, referring to the study's findings about the impact of student voice. So these were more general codes, and they kind of meant that, let's say a student found some desirable impact in a study, such as decreased absenteeism or increased collaboration between students and teachers, then students could code that as positive. Or let's say a study found that student voice leads to increase civic engagement, but only if it's properly implemented in a school system, then that could be classified as positive conditional. And so we kind of went through that framework to do this more general round of coding. And then the second round of coding was a little bit more intensive, and it involved classifying the specific impacts of the study. So, for example, if students noted that a study's finding indicated that there was improved academic performance in a school after a student voice initiative was implemented, then they could use the code academic improvement. So these more specific coding categories are really how we were able to identify our key findings and ultimately our key themes. So after these overall themes were identified, students were assigned partners to write up findings for each of these 5 key themes. And each of these partner pairs would write one-pagers regarding their specific key theme. Students would outline which studies they utilized in their write-ups, and then we combined all of the students' key theme one-pagers. And the Seek Common Ground team did several rounds of editing for cohesiveness and to really finalize the report flow and design. And then we also had some of our student researchers review the report after editing, and they were given the opportunity to provide any feedback on the report. Before we delve into our findings, I do just want to note a few limitations to note when reading our report. As students ourselves and student researchers, moreover, we do have lived experience with student voice practices, which we have personally benefited from. So we recognize that we do bring a particularly positive lens to the research question itself. And then the second thing to note is that the qualitative and quantitative training that we provided to students was not carried out at a graduate or doctoral level. However, that being said, the intent of this report was to engage in a landscape review of the literature on the benefits of student voice, not necessarily to submit this report for formal academic publication. We are confident that our coding conversations did yield reliability through continual collaborative conversation, and we were frequently having rounds of editing with Assistant Professor Daniela DiGiacomo as well. And we do believe that this report will bring valuable research tested insights to anyone who reads it. So now that we've gone through all my disclosures, I know you guys are really excited to hear the findings of the report and to go ahead and meet our student researchers. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Rosanna.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rosanna, and I'm currently a senior at Mayfield High School in Cleveland, Ohio. I am also the co-founder of a student-led tech initiative called Youth Unite, which is how I became a part of SANE and was able to participate in this research project. So our first key theme is about the impact of student voice initiatives on academic outcomes. We reviewed numerous studies that demonstrated a link between student voice and academic success, meaning attendance, grades, or classroom and/or school engagement. 10 studies show that student voice directly increased school engagement. Among these studies, we saw some studies that show that when students were listened to, they were more engaged inside and outside of the classroom, sometimes even taking on additional projects or leadership roles. We saw that student voice improved academic performance, such as grades and test scores, and students exposed to certain student voice initiatives showed more consistent attendance. 14 studies we reviewed also found that student voice opportunities help teach 21st century skills like research, collaboration, and advocacy. To provide a deeper dive into this key theme, I will delve into one specific study from 2022. In this study, authors utilized a dataset from Chicago Public Schools, and they used 86 schools in their sample. The authors found a consistent positive relationship between school responsiveness to student voice and student grades. This relationship is strengthened by the fact that the authors also found it to be statistically significant. Ultimately, this builds stronger reasoning that when students feel their perspectives matter, they are more engaged, more connected to their school community, and more invested in their learning. And now I'll pass it over to Ellen.
Hi, I'm Ellen, and I'm currently a freshman at the University of Kentucky. And when we started this research project, I was still in high school, where I was involved with the Kentucky Student Voice Team, which is how I found out about SANE in this research project. I also worked with Seek Common Ground, to design the graphics for this report. I'm going to talk about our second key theme, which is that student voice and educator supports lead to improved student-teacher relationships. As students, we know sometimes adults can potentially get in the way of impactful youth-adult relationships, and this is something we saw in the research as well. Multiple studies we reviewed talked about the importance of addressing the power imbalance between adults and students in order to have successful student voice initiatives. The research showed that sometimes, even when teachers wanted to implement student voice practices, they didn't always have the tools necessary, such as having too many other priorities, too many students in a classroom, or not having enough administrative support. Teachers must have adequate support to implement student voice in their classrooms, as 9 of the studies noted. However, we saw that when teachers are trained, supported, and able to implement student voice, they're not only improving learning outcomes for their students, but may also experience positive impacts themselves. 2 studies noted that when teachers engage students as partners in shaping teaching, teachers experience deeper reflection and develop insights into effective teaching strategies, which led to changes in their teaching approach. One article by Jerusha O'Connor described how teachers may conceptualize student voice differently, with more than half of the sample describing it as students having a say in their education. This subset of teachers primarily use methods such as surveys and class discussions to solicit student voice. The other almost half of the sample described it as students sharing their opinions more broadly, not necessarily tied to education. These educators oftentimes use tactics such as turn and talk, think, pair, share, and student journals to listen to student voices. The study found that teachers who do solicit student voice often adjust their teaching practices and communicate these changes to students, reinforcing existing research showing that student voice leads to more responsive instruction. Another study involved the implementation of an initiative in which students were allowed to give feedback to teachers on their practice. One student talked about how meaningful it was to see her teachers tangibly take notes of their thoughts, saying, "The teachers actually respected our opinion and related to it and took it on board. We thought that they were just going to go, but they actually took it on board." Another student discussed her rationale for wanting to serve as a student pupil observer in the initiative, saying, "I would like the job of pupil observer because I think teachers have a difficult and demanding job, and I would like to see and observe what it is like on a daily basis for them. Also, it is a special role that allows pupils to say something about um, to say something about lessons so that changes can be made if needed. Together, these student reflections show that when teachers actively support student voice, students feel respected, engaged, and invested in the learning process. And now I'll pass it over to Haley.
Hi everyone. My name is Haley. I'm a sophomore at Katy High School in Katy, Texas. I'm a part of Students Engaged in Advancing Texas, which is how I found out about SANE and this project. I'm going to talk about our third key theme, which is the impact of student voice on school climate. We've reviewed several case studies on schools that implemented student voice programs as tools for improving school culture. These schools showed that by listening to student expertise and relying on student expertise, they were able to improve student climate for individual students and the school as a whole. This was particularly true for marginalized students whose voices are often not as listened to as their peers. To delve into some specific research, a study in 2024 followed one school district that used student climate survey data to drive equity-focused reform. Before I delve into the specifics of the study, I wanted to go ahead and define what a school climate survey is. School climate surveys assess various aspects of schools, such as culture, academics, and other things related to that. They may often be co-created by students. With that context, I'll return to the details of the study. Students in grades 3 through 12 were surveyed about their experiences with safety, well-being, and racism within their schools. The district then paired the data with a series of professional development sessions where educators were trained to interpret the results with an equity lens. This meant learning to disaggregate data by race, gender, language status, and disability, and using thematic analysis to identify disparities that may have been overlooked. Educators applied this training to lead structural changes, such as revising disciplinary policies and updating curriculum materials, while also following up directly with students and families to validate the findings. The study's findings also repeatedly emphasize that student climate data must be met with intentional efforts like professional development, community engagement, strategic planning, and ongoing reflection in order to be genuinely impactful. One district educator emphasized the straightforward pipeline of transforming data from students into timely action, saying, we can make a distinct professional learning offering. So let's say, for instance, if there's a trend related to the survey item, I have adults that I can go to for support at school. If that trend is low, then maybe focus on a direct professional learning about how to build relationships with students. Another teacher describes their feelings when reading some student responses about not truly being able to be themselves at school, saying that the evidence is kind of like, oh man, it kind of stings, right? You're like, gosh, how does that feel like you can't be yourself? How do you learn if you can't be yourself? How do you feel safe if you can't be yourself? Together, these reflections and findings show that when student climate data are taken seriously and acted upon, they can promote equity, help educators better understand their students, and drive meaningful school-wide changes that reflect students' real experiences. I'll now pass it back to Rosanna.
Our fourth key theme is how student voice builds skills for community and civic engagement. We read studies that found that student voice gives students skills like empathy and advocacy that shape their belief in their ability to make change in their communities. We read a 2020 study in Oakland, California that showed that students who trained in research and reporting went on to influence local policy decisions. We also saw a longitudinal study that correlated teachers using democratic practices in their homerooms with long-term increased attitudes towards civic engagement. This study utilized longitudinal data regarding Black and Latino youth and civic engagement predictors. Results at time 1 indicated that teachers employing democratic practices in homerooms and in classrooms were correlated with increased frequency of behaviors that rooted in civic engagement. Furthermore, students who indicated more equitable practices within their school also typically had stronger civic engagement attitudes. This data was not just a short-term impact, however, because a year later, when students were surveyed, the association between teachers' use of democratic homeroom and classroom practices was still aligned with increased civic engagement attitudes. In this study, civic engagement attitudes referred to as once believed that it was important for them to address various societal issues. We were able to learn about civic engagement in the international context as well through another study based on Padova, Italy. This study focused on adolescents' life contexts school project intervention involving 12-year-old students. These students spoke about their lived experiences to decision makers, and teachers and council members supported the work. Quantitative results showed a statistically significant difference in civic responsibility towards the neighborhood between the treatment group versus the control. And qualitative findings through reflections tended to be positive, and responses showed aspects of critical awareness, control, and participation, which were the focus of the study. Overall, these studies show that when students in schools use democratic practices and give students real opportunities to share their perspectives, students are more likely to develop lasting interest in civic engagement and feel a stronger sense of responsibility and connection to their communities, both in short term and over time. And back over to you, Ellen.
Our final key theme is the impact of student voice on student mental health and well-being. As students, we know that schools can be rigid, structured places that don't always meet our social and emotional needs. In our review, studies showed that when marginalized students or students facing personal challenges were involved in student voice, it could help them with emotional regulation and self-confidence. Student voice offers students the opportunity to express themselves, which is validating. It also gives them opportunities for problem solving, which is important in building emotional resilience. Finally, inclusive practices that elevate the voices of underrepresented groups create more supportive environments, providing these students with a sense of agency and belonging. One study we reviewed about student voice and well-being examined a student-led participatory action research project in an Australian secondary school. This study found that involving students in the design and implementation of positive education helped schools better understand the student well-being, increased student buy-in, and led to gains in students' engagement, self-efficacy, and sense of agency. The students shared that being involved in school decisions and improving mental health and well-being initiatives was meaningful and rewarding. Another study provides that increased insight into the ways student voice and well-being can overlap. The authors discuss that students from both the qualitative and the quantitative phases of the study nominated having a say at school as integral to well-being. These students discussed that it was not just about having a say in the public or political sphere of the school, but was also important to be able to express their own and more candid experiences about issues pertaining to their own personal lives. The authors also convey that strong, trusting student-teacher relationships and open dialogue are essential for student voice, as feeling heard and respected fosters belonging and well-being, while the absence of these conditions may leave students feeling disengaged. Studies like these indicate that student voice may not just be associated with academic improvements, but can also be used as a mechanism to better support student well-being. With greater outlets to share their thoughts and opinions, students can feel like their schools truly care and value them as people, not just students. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Spandana.
Okay, wonderful. So those were our 5 key themes. Thank you so much to Rosanna, Ellen, and Haley for sharing our findings. The next part of our publication is really about best practices and implementation. While we know that the impacts of good student voice initiatives are great, we saw in our review that the implementation could vary. And when implementation varied, the results could also vary. I'm going to pass it back to our student researchers to talk about 5 components that we identified as being important for truly successful student voice initiatives. Ellen, I'll pass it back over to you.
Yeah, so I already talked about this a bit earlier, but it's really important, so we put it in here as well. Meaningful partnerships between students and teachers are a two-way street. One study evaluating project-based learning student voice found 50 district mentions of relationships with teachers, peers, and administration across 6 administered interviews. This indicated to us that these relationships are closely interlinked with student voice.
Our second component of successful student voice initiatives is avoiding tokenism. Roughly 28% of the studies we reviewed warned against symbolic student voice, where feedback is requested or allowed, but only in a performative way. We saw that when students participated in student voice initiatives and were vulnerable with administrations, but saw little to no actual change in school policy or behavior, that they lost their trust in school leadership, and the normal benefits we associate with student voice were instead reversed.
Another component of successful student voice initiatives is structure. About 18% of the studies found that having a clear framework and process for collecting and using student voice made a big difference. While we did not find a single best method for student voice implementation, it was clear to us that structure and process ensures that student inputs turn into real action and outcomes. For more concrete ideas for student voice implementation, one review article delineates 5 primary mechanisms that help build student leadership and support effective student voice. The first is research to inform decision making, often through participatory action research where students are directly involved in gathering and analyzing data to shape school decisions. The second is consistency, such as holding meetings regularly at the same time and place, which helps student voice feel stable and sustainable rather than symbolic. The third is a clear governance structure, meaning students have defined roles within a school's formal decision-making system. The fourth mechanism is recognition, where students' leadership work is acknowledged or compensated, reinforcing that their contributions are valued. And finally, group makeup matters. Studies found that smaller groups with balanced youth-adult ratios were more effective in fostering authentic collaboration.
We also identified the importance of power sharing as a component. About 18% of the studies mentioned that school culture must support shared power among students, teachers, and other faculty. Otherwise, even the best student ideas will stay surface level. In the studies, schools that normalized student-adult power sharing saw more equitable environments and reduced participation gaps. This recommendation echoes a study by Dana Mitra, which indicates that without intentional power sharing and legitimacy for student roles, student voice initiatives are likely to remain symbolic rather than transformative. Some of the mechanisms for student voice power sharing include student compensation, intentional built time for check-ins, small group sizes so each student could be heard, explicitly addressing power dynamics in conversation, among others.
And our final component is collaboration amongst students. Several of the studies we reviewed talked about how critical student collaboration is. One study found that these student voice practices, particularly those embedded in student-led leadership, were associated with the development of peer relationships characterized by mutual respect and collaboration amongst students.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you guys so much. In our report, we also give recommendations for action items when engaging in student voice, as well as a list of student voice initiatives that our student researcher approved. The studies that we reviewed are mostly applicable to school administrators, educators, and leaders of community-based organizations, but honestly, it's really for anyone hoping to increase student voice in their initiatives. They can also benefit from these recommendations. So I'll go ahead and delve into the first recommendation, which is to begin by intentionally setting the stage, asking stakeholders, including students, educators, administrators, and families, what student voice means to them, how they see it showing up in practice, and whether it already exists in their communities. These conversations really should explicitly center students since their perspectives are often the most at risk of being overlooked. As discussed earlier, one study found that educators often conceptualize student voice in potentially different ways, which can lead to misalignment between intention and practice. So, really creating a space for shared understanding at the outset will help to ensure that student voice efforts are grounded in common expectations rather than just assumptions. Our second recommendation is to develop a strong structure. Don't just allow for student voice. It's very important that Student Voice Initiative have avenues for students to express their opinions that are really backed by institutional power and adults who are ready to turn student ideas into results. For example, this could include a formal student roles in school governance bodies, student climate surveys that are directly tied to professional development or policy changes, or student-led research groups that present findings to administrators. Several studies also emphasize the importance of having consistent meeting times, clear decision-making pathways, and a recognition or compensation for student leadership to ensure that student voice leads to actual genuine change and is not just symbolic. Our final recommendation is to create shared projects and roundtables to strengthen belonging and connection for students. Involving students in more shared student voice projects and discussions will help set classroom and school norms where really every student is involved in shaping the school culture. And it's also about being truly intentional about gathering a diverse range of student voices to ensure that initiatives do not just reflect the needs of one small subset of students. In our report, we included a full list of student researcher approved student voice projects as inspiration to get you started. And now to transition from our recommendations into our conclusion piece, we found a lot of empirical evidence for there being positive benefits to student voice practices. We really would encourage teachers, schools, practitioners, really anyone to use these practices and our recommendations. Now, we would like to note that there are fewer studies that discuss the longer term impacts of student voice on communities and life outside the classroom. As a young researcher myself, I would love to see a focus on addressing this gap in this field. For example, groups like the Student Action Network for Equity have unprecedented levels of access to student groups and alumni networks. A clear next step could be to conduct surveys of former youth organizers or students in schools that have implemented student voice practices to see how these initiatives may impact adult behavior later down the line. So before we open it up for any questions, I would love to take a moment to have our student researchers just briefly tell us about their experience in this project and whether they have any reflections on their participation in this work. So Rosanna, I'll just bump it over to you to start us off.
So I would say that being a part of this research project showed me how student voice can move beyond my and other students' personal experiences as a student and become a real and evidence-based research. I also really enjoyed working on it, and I gained a lot of hands-on research skills like conducting literature review and coding studies, which I'm sure that will definitely help me in my later academic pursuits.
When I first started this research project, I had close to no experience researching in depth. But throughout this process, I've gotten to enhance my skills, and I now feel confident in analyzing research studies myself. Spandana and the rest of the team were incredible to work with and provided lots of support that allowed me to become a better researcher. This research has additionally provided incredible insight into the impacts of student voice and emphasized the importance that my work and so many others as student advocates has. This was an incredible experience, and I'm so glad I got to participate.
I originally applied to work on this project because I'd never done research before, and it seemed like a really cool opportunity to learn more about it. But I was also really nervous at first, and I felt like I wasn't going to have any idea what I was doing or what was going on. But Bandana was really supportive the entire time, which made it really easy for me to participate in and to learn about research along the way. And afterwards, I felt a lot more comfortable with identifying as a student research, and this experience has even like prepared me for my college classes where I've had to read through lots of research papers, which I didn't have experience doing through my high school classes. And then it was also really cool to see how this research related to and like supported my real life experiences doing student voice work with the Kentucky Student Voice team. And it was super interesting to like read studies that reflected my own experiences of participating in student voice work. And it allowed me to see like the larger picture of the importance of these opportunities.
Thank you guys so much for sharing about your experiences. It genuinely makes me so happy to hear that. And I also want, like, as a student myself who dove into youth participatory action research when I was a freshman in high school, I did want to take a moment just to reflect on this work personally as well. I was thinking back to the first day I joined the Kentucky Student Voice team, and I was hearing about this coping with COVID study. And this was right in the wake of school closures during the pandemic. And I remember texting one of the older members of the team asking to be a part of it. And kind of apologizing because I didn't have that much research experience. I remember like at the beginning feeling underqualified. I didn't know that much about research methods. I'd never been involved with a study on this scale. And I didn't have any formal degrees as a freshman in high school. Um, but I remember throughout the project, our adult ally, Daniela DiGiacomo, who you've probably heard her name many times, we've been working together for a long time, and all of the older student leads always made sure to just ask me my opinions, whether it was on an interview protocol and whether the questions felt fitting or whether the codes that we came up with felt relevant and accurate to student responses. And it was really in these moments that I began to realize that my expertise came from the fact that I was also a student actively living through the pandemic, meaning I could help ensure that we're asking questions that feel relevant. A few years later, I eventually became the lead of this Coping with COVID study, which felt very full circle. And I was able to help assist in telling the story of thousands of Kentucky students who had their entire educational experience shift completely in the matter of mere days. And I would say it was in this moment that I really reflected on this journey of YPAR and was able to kind of address this misconception I had that my youth was one of my limitations because I actually came to see it as genuinely one of my greatest qualifications in this research work. So when I was asked to lead this literature review project, I remember being nervous because I'd never led a group of students in doing a literature review before. But as myself and this team navigated the challenges and successes and little hiccups of the research process together, I felt a lot of gratitude for just still having this opportunity to connect my passion for STEM and advocacy and to watch our students make this project their own and really get to experience the wonderful gifts of youth participatory action research. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Lydia to facilitate Q&A if we have any questions. But I truly appreciate all of you for coming.
Yay! I'm so impressed with all the work that you guys have done. I'm sure everyone else on the call is as well. Spandan has been referring to this kind of as her research baby, so it feels like we finally like delivered, and here we are, and I'm just like so proud of her and the whole team. We're gonna now move over to Q&A. So, I believe there's like a Zoom Q&A box. If you can find it, feel free to submit questions there. Or if you can't find that, feel free to just dump them in the chat. But yeah, no, let's see what questions y'all have. But we can get it started with my first question, which is for our student researchers. I'd love to hear a little bit about like those first few meetings that you had with the research team. I know at the beginning of this presentation, Spandana talked about like we taught them about conditional coding. We taught them about all this stuff. Like how did that sort of feel? Were you overwhelmed? Like how just like talk me through your feelings like navigating that process. And I'd love it if we could start Haley with you.
Awesome. So I was genuinely terrified going into this. I had no idea, nothing about research. And then I met Spandana and it was really awesome. Like she explained everything step by step. I felt like if I had any questions, I could immediately get answers to them and everything felt super clear. So it was a little scary doing those first couple, like finding the studies and then the first time coding. That was It's a little bit scary, but all in all, the team was super supportive and it just helped us out a lot.
Yeah, I would agree. Like at first I was kind of terrified and like I feel like during the first Zoom meetings when I would like hear these different terms, I would like open a tab and Google what they meant and I had no idea what was happening. But like Spandana just helped like she was always like so I don't know, like gracious at answering any questions we had and like wanted to make sure like everyone was on the same page and like I always felt like could go to her if I didn't understand anything. And yeah, at first I kind of felt like, oh, I'm probably doing everything wrong. I don't know what I'm doing. But I think like through the experience, I became more comfortable and like confident in myself.
I was also genuinely excited to join this project because I was planning to enroll to an AP research course and gaining research experience on a topic that I am passionate about, which is student voice, sounded like a great opportunity. And for the first few meetings, I think Spandana did a really great job explaining us about the purpose of our research and the process that we were going to follow and the tools that we were going to use. And I honestly did not feel overwhelmed because everything was clear and straightforward. And I really enjoyed working on it.
That is awesome. I have a question from the chat, which is, or from the Q&A box, which is about the types of infrastructure or resources that y'all needed to like bring this project to fruition.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this on. And then if any of our students feel like I'm missing anything, feel free to jump in at any moment. But I think this is a great question just because I think like we're seeing the study kind of like done, but like how did we even get here? And like it is a thorough process. So I would say the first things that kind of come to mind regarding like infrastructure and resources is first, the fact that Sea Common Ground received and managed a grant from the Hewlett Foundation to manage the project and process payments was really helpful and also allowed us to compensate our students and adult allies. We think that compensation is so critical to the work we do because we just wanted to make sure that our students were being recognized for the like large amounts of time that they were contributing towards this work. I would say another thing was even having an adult ally, like Daniela that I mentioned, was definitely a really important resource. Like I mentioned, we had her come in and hold a meeting with our students, and they had her as a contact if they needed, but also just on some of like the editing back end, like if I was kind of tackling more convoluted questions about how to go about like citations and more technical things, like I could message Daniela and we could hop on a call and work through that. So I think having someone who really had like a lot of formal research expertise as well was like really helpful to go through this process. Another resource that I think was pretty invaluable was our like Common Ground team, because we were able to help court like Claudia, Lydia, and Sandy were all able to help coordinate payments to students, help me formulate a timeline that felt reasonable. And then also they were able to really support in like reviewing the document and going through rounds of editing. And I mean, there was points I was like gonna drive myself crazy over like an additional comma. So like they really helped with a lot of that as well. I would say another resource that sped up the process was the fact that we had like access to a group of like students already. SANE works as like a network that allows for communication across like many youth orgs. So we were able to kind of tap into that network, send it in our channels pretty quick and hear back from students. But that would have been, I think, a little bit more of an intensive effort had we not had that direct access to young people. And then I think also it was helpful that I was able to come in with some prior research background, knew a little bit about YPAR and like how to facilitate like meetings like this just because of like prior experience. So I think that was definitely like a critical aspect of this whole thing, just because I think this would have been a little bit difficult to like lead blind. But I also was supported by my professor at Vanderbilt, Andres Pinedo, who I've done a literature review in his lab. So having that context and background also helped me to carry out this project. So I think that if Rosanna, Ellen, Haley, if there's anything I missed that you guys want to add in, feel free to do so. But that's kind of my initial thoughts there.
I think one more thing that also facilitated the process of this research project was that the people in our team had different experiences with research, some more, some less. But especially through when we were paired up to work on documents, when one person had more experience than the other, we were able to share some feedback and take advantage of each other's resources. For example, like databases beyond Google Scholar, and I think that was also very helpful.
That's awesome. Thank you. So we've got a question in the question box from Karen, who's the program manager of the Responsible Tech Youth Power Fund. She said, "Great job, everyone," and that she enjoyed learning about your findings. But then she also wanted to know if there's any findings that were like surprising or that really resonated with y'all, and she wants to know what they were and why.
Yeah, I'm happy to tackle this and then I'll let all of our students answer. I mean, I think one of this is a little bit more like meta and kind of like looking at the project as a whole, but I guess like I'd always felt so strongly about student voice and the way it like completely transformed my life. I feel like K through 12, it didn't necessarily always feel like an outlet in like the school system. Like it just felt like very traditional like roles and dynamics. And so like joining Kentucky Student Voice Team, like genuinely completely like I went from being pre-med to I'm now public policy. Like it was so transformative. And so I think just seeing like how much like the magnitude of like sheer data that like validated like my experience was like really really like powerful, and that was like a really cool experience just to feel like so seen that like other students like are experiencing this, and like why like this shouldn't be something so radical, like why isn't this more normalized, because like maybe even if students themselves don't have this, like student anecdotes don't have like the legitimacy, like the research is also saying it. But another thing is I think I like referenced this, I think we referenced this study when we were talking, but there's one study where like an educator is like, oh my, like reflecting on like these students saying like we don't feel like we can be ourselves in school, and he's like that like shocked, like how do you learn if you like don't even feel safe and feel comforted and feel like you have a place in school. And like I think like hearing those like educator responses and really seeing like what like the conversation and back end dynamic of like doing like school climate surveys and hearing from students, like I think that was really powerful and showed me that like a lot of this isn't like about like like I think if we have more mechanisms for like providing student inputs and student feedback, like it really would bridge so much understanding, because I found that like in that study, like the educators were so empathetic to the issues that students were dealing with, but it was a matter of like even getting like this data from the students. So I will let any of our students share some of the findings that particularly resonated with them or shocked.
Yeah, so one that specifically resonated with me was I found it super interesting that when students felt like their voices were heard within schools, their attendance rates increased. And I just thought that was a cool little tidbit to share.
Another finding that was really surprising to me was related to the symbolic student voice. For example, when you see a school having a student council, you may think that, oh, at least they're doing something. But the thing is that if that student council doesn't have a lot of power, a lot of decision-making power, it can discourage students from participating as much as they would if their voices saw real action after like expressing them.
Yeah, I would say I was also just like surprised by the sheer amount of like research that had been done like to support student voice, and like I didn't like realize how well researched of an area it was. And like I remember reading through some of the studies and like seeing different like structures or like ideas that we talked about like at the Kentucky Student Voice team, or like seeing like how our team was structured was like based on this research I was reading about, and that was just so cool to see. And then I think I was also like going into it, I just kind of assumed like student voice is like good or like positive. It's like a given, like that there's going to be positive impacts. So it was like interesting to see how like these impacts are also contingent on certain factors. Like student voice has the possibility to become like performative, or like maybe like teachers aren't getting enough support that they need to actually implement it so that student voice can like actually have an impact. So that was interesting to like learn about and kind of challenge what I originally anticipated.
Thank you all so much for sharing. I think we have time for a couple more questions. So I have one from the box, and then if anyone wants to write in a final one, it will be the final one. But another question from someone in the chat is about how you synthesized all the data you collected. You talked about, like over 80 peer-reviewed studies. How did you turn that into this report? So I have a little insight on that, and so I'm going to ask a specific question, which is for Rosanna, Ellen, and Haley about like what was the process like when you were doing your write-up on like the things that you studied. I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit more about that. And then Spandana, if you want to talk about how you took all of that and turned it into this report. So Ellen, do you want to start?
Yeah. I think I remember like we kind of worked in like pairs or smaller groups, and we would go through like a certain section or like certain amount of studies that we've been assigned, and we go through each one and kind of work together to like figure out what different codes would fit for them, and then we'd like read over what each other wrote and like make sure we agreed with what each of us was saying, or like that we had both had like a common understanding of what the studies were saying. And then I remember I think Haley and I worked together on like specifically focusing on the theme of like student teacher relationships, and we like collected each of the studies. We like went through all the studies to find which ones had that code for student teacher relationships, and then we just kind of collectively looked at them to try to put together like a summary of what all these different studies were saying. And yeah, so collaboration in like smaller groups was part of it. But Haley and Rosanna, you all can add on to that.
So going off what, oh, sorry, Rosanna. Going
You can
off
go.
of, okay. Going off of what Ellen said, we worked in pairs for it. And so you would do, first we started out by coding them. You would do your first round of coding, and then your partner would code the same studies. And then we did our second rounds. And once we had those two sets of coding, me and Ellen got on a Zoom, and then we talked through all the studies, as she said, and essentially wrote it up and then revised and revised and revised. Rosanna, if you have anything to add, go ahead.
So, throughout this synthesizing process, I was paired up with Vic, and we had a slightly different approach. So, what we did after the 2 rounds of coding, we had a chart that contained the key themes about the topic that we were assigned, which was the contributors to successful student voice. And we organized all of the studies into the different key points within our topic. And after that, we also got on a Zoom call. We discussed the studies and pulled out the key themes that we think that would really contribute to the findings of our one pager. And that's kind of how we synthesized our data.
Yeah, I mean, I think they all covered it pretty comprehensively, but yeah, there are documents I would like literally like go back in the version history of their write-ups, and like it was like so I was so impressed because like a lot of them would like literally like list out like a specific sub theme of like let's say for like teacher student relations, like some of the studies talked about how like these relationships could also benefit teachers, and like they would like have a little heading that said like benefits to teachers, and like just like list out like the numbers in the spreadsheet that like correlated to like studies. So it was like very organized and like kind of cool to see like the way they were able to like process so much information and like delineate it by like these specific findings. So it honestly made my life really easy because I just kind of had to do like the making it feel cohesive across students, but like they did the meat of like the processing, the like studies themselves, like they did the meat of that work.
Yeah, awesome. And those things that Rosanna and Haley and Ellen were talking about, you probably heard us talk about them in the report. So students, of course, wrote all of their write-ups, and then Spanina edited them into the report that you can see on our website. So I think that's all the questions we had. So I'll just go ahead and do our thank yous. So first of all, thank you to all of you guys who are here with us, who've been with us through this whole hour. Thanks for coming. I hope that you learned something. And I hope that you find time to check out the full report at the link on screen. I think my coworker Claudia is also going to put it in the chat if you want to take a deeper dive into what our research looked like. So I really quickly want to thank, of course, Spandana, our fearless leader, all 7 of our student researchers, so the 3 you met here, and then also Vic, Tess, Jiva, and Mez. Also the Seek Common Ground team, so that would be Sandy and Claudia, to Spanina's research professor, Andres Pinedo, who is at Vanderbilt, and also to Daniela DiGiacomo at the University of Kentucky, who's been super helpful through all of this work. And of course to Ellen again, because she did the graphic design for this work, and of course the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for funding this work. If you guys have any questions about the process or you just want to learn more, that's my email. You should reach out to me. Unfortunately, Spunnen is actually leaving us because she's going abroad to Sydney, Australia in like 2 weeks. So you're not going to be able to get in touch with her. But if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. That's my email there. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. I hope you all have a safe and warm holiday season. So with that, everyone, I'll bid you adieu. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.